The room was a sterile, cold chamber buried deep beneath the surface of the facility, far from prying eyes. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly pale glow on the steel surfaces. Dr. Helena Strauss stood at the head of the operating table, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the hum of the machines around her, each one calibrated with meticulous care, every piece of equipment set up precisely for this moment. This was it. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, years of research, countless sleepless nights, and the quiet, desperate funding from faceless benefactors had led to this room. Her team was poised around the room, their faces concealed by masks, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They all knew what was at stake. They all understood that what they were attempting had never been done before. On the steel slab lay the body of a man, a John Doe who had died in a violent car accident over a year ago. His body had been meticulously preserved, his skin a pallid shade of gray, stretched tight over his bones. The stitches from his autopsy were still visible, dark and precise lines running across his chest like a macabre patchwork. He was nobody special, no family to mourn him, no friends to ask questions. That was why they had chosen him. He was a perfect subject. Or at least, that's what they had thought. Helena adjusted the collar of her lab coat, trying to suppress the unease that gnawed at the back of her mind. It wasn't the first time she had performed a procedure like this, but this was different. This was unnatural. But she reminded herself that it was necessary for science, for progress, for the future. That was what she had been telling herself for months, the words a mantra that drowned out the whisper of her conscience. "Vitals?" she asked, her voice clipped, professional. "Stable," came the response from Dr. Parker, her assistant. He glanced at the monitors, his brow furrowing slightly. "Brain activity is flat-lined, as expected. No signs of life." Helena nodded, her eyes flicking to the syringe in her hand. It was filled with a clear, viscous fluid, something that no one outside of this room knew existed. They had synthesized it from samples retrieved from a crash site, a material that seemed to pulse and shimmer under the lab lights, almost as if it were alive. They had no idea where it came from or what it truly was. All they knew was that it was the key. "Commence the injection," she ordered. Dr. Parker hesitated for a split second, then took the syringe and inserted it into the IV line. The fluid flowed through the tubes, winding its way into the veins of the lifeless man on the table. Helena watched, her heart beating faster as the monitors began to spike. There was a soft hiss, followed by a low, throbbing hum as the machines surged to life. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a strange electric tension. The man's body twitched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, then another, more pronounced. His fingers curled and his chest heaved as if he was trying to take a breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Helena's eyes were locked on the man's face, waiting, hoping, dreading. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, his eyes snapped open. The room was silent, the hum of the machines fading into the background as every pair of eyes turned toward the man on the slab. His eyes were wide, glassy, but there was something there, something more than just the reflexes of a body being jolted back to life. He gasped, a ragged guttural sound that echoed in the stillness. Helena's breath caught in her throat as he turned his head, his gaze fixing on her. His eyes were dark, empty, like twin abysses that seemed to swallow the light around them. He tried to speak, his lips moving, but no sound came out. Helena leaned in closer, close enough to hear the faint, dry rasp of his breath. She could smell the faint, acrid scent of chemicals mingling with something else. Something old, decayed, like the smell of damp earth. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment there was nothing, just the harsh, labored sound of his breathing. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and a hoarse whisper slipped out, so soft she had to strain to hear it. "We're not alone." Helena felt a chill crawl down her spine, her skin prickling with a cold, creeping dread. She took a step back, her eyes widening as the man's mouth twisted into a strange, almost sad smile. His voice was low, raspy, like the wind whispering through a graveyard. "We never were." Before she could react, the machines blared, a cacophony of beeps and alarms that shattered the silence. The man convulsed, his body jerking violently, the monitors flashing erratically, as if something was fighting to take control. Dr. Parker rushed to stabilize him, but Helena couldn't move. She was frozen, staring into those dark, hollow eyes, unable to look away. It was as if, for a brief moment, she could see something within them, something vast, dark, and ancient, a presence that stretched far beyond the confines of the room, far beyond the limits of Earth itself. It was as if she was staring into the void, and the void was staring back at her, whispering secrets that no human was ever meant to know. "Sedate him," someone shouted, but it sounded distant, muffled, like a voice echoing from the end of a long tunnel. The man's body convulsed again, and this time his eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Helena snapped out of her trance, stumbling back as Dr. Parker injected a sedative into the IV line. Slowly, the convulsions subsided, the monitors quieting until only the soft, steady beep of a heartbeat remained. The man lay still, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Helena felt her legs give out and she slumped into a chair, her hands trembling. She could still hear his voice echoing in her mind, a dark, foreboding whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "We're not alone. We never were." As the team rushed around her, frantically checking the equipment and securing the restraints on the man's wrists, Helena's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she had just seen, what she had just heard. She wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew better. Something had changed, something had been awakened, and there was no turning back now. As she stared at the still, pale figure on the slab, she felt a creeping sense of dread, a realization that chilled her to the bone. Whatever they had brought back, it wasn't just a man, it was a messenger. Helena stared at the monitor, watching the jagged lines of brain activity spike erratically across the screen. Subject 0 was sedated, his body restrained on the table, but his mind was awake. More awake than she'd ever seen, more alive than it should be. No human brain could display such patterns, not even during a seizure. This was something else, something that defied every law of biology she knew. She clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the unease gnawing at her. Over the past few days, they'd conducted countless tests, drawn vials of blood, monitored every heartbeat, every twitch of his muscles. But none of it made sense. There were anomalies, spikes in cellular regeneration, strange electromagnetic pulses that would emanate from his body at random intervals, as if whatever had been brought back wasn't just reanimating him, but changing him. But it wasn't just his physical state, it was his eyes. When they were open, they felt less like eyes and more like windows, dark portals peering out into something far beyond the limits of comprehension. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always the same. Disjointed, half-formed phrases that seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a sinister message buried beneath the surface. Helena had kept the team busy, urging them to focus on the data, trying to distract them from the creeping sense of dread that seemed to hang over the lab like a dark cloud. But deep down, she knew that whatever they had done, it wasn't right. It was unnatural, and it was dangerous. That night, the lab was almost empty, most of the staff having left for a much-needed break. Only Helena remained, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. She was reviewing the latest set of scans when she heard it, the soft, dry rustle of movement behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the assistants. Instead, she found herself staring into the cold, empty eyes of Subject Zero. He was sitting up on the slab, the restraints hanging loose around his wrists, his face partially hidden by the shadows. Helena's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. He shouldn't have been able to move, not with the sedatives they had given him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt smaller, the air heavy and suffocating, as if it was being sucked out by some invisible force. "Dr. Strauss," he said, his voice low and unnaturally calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Why do you think they brought me back?" Helena hesitated, her mind scrambling for an answer, but the words wouldn't come. She could see something shifting in his eyes, something dark and endless, like the depths of a black hole. We wanted to see if it was possible," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "To bring someone back, to cheat death," he interrupted, a faint smile creeping across his lips. "To play God." He leaned forward and Helena instinctively took a step back, her hands shaking. "But it was never your decision to make, was it? You didn't bring me back." "They did." The way he said, "they" sent chills down her spine. It was as if he was referring to someone, or something, she couldn't see, something that was watching them both. "Who?" she whispered, her heart pounding. "Who are you talking about?" He tilted his head, the smile widening, stretching unnaturally across his face. "The Watchers," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "The ones who have been here long before your kind learned to crawl out of the oceans. The ones who have seen worlds rise and fall, and they will see yours fall too." Helena's legs felt weak, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. That's impossible. You're not making any sense." "Oh, but I am," he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "You've spent your entire life looking for answers, but you've been asking the wrong questions. You think this is about life, about death. But it's so much more than that." He raised his hand, and Helena saw something move beneath his skin, a dark, writhing mass that pulsed and shifted like a living thing. She could feel the bile rise in her throat, but she couldn't look away. "They see everything," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "They see through me, through you, through all of you, and they've been waiting so patiently for someone like you to open the door." Helena felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. What door?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The one you opened when you brought me back," he said, his gaze unfaltering. "You thought you were resurrecting a man, but you were really waking a gate. You've let them see, and now they know that the key works. That's why they sent me back, to show you the truth. He slowly lowered his hand, and the dark shape beneath his skin settled, disappearing from view. Helena could still feel it, though, as if it was crawling just beneath the surface, just out of sight. "They've been watching your world for eons," he said, his tone shifting, becoming colder, more detached. "Waiting for the right moment. You think your world is special, that your species matters. But it doesn't. You're just another planet, another experiment, another piece of the puzzle, and now they're ready to take it back." Helena could barely breathe, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold, an endless expanse of darkness, filled with countless eyes, all watching, all hungry. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why are they doing this?" Subject Zero's smile faded, and for a moment she thought she saw something like sadness in his eyes. "Because they've done it before," he said quietly, "and they'll do it again. Your kind is nothing but a flicker in the dark, a momentary distraction. They've seen 1,000 worlds like yours, and they'll see 1,000 more after it's gone." The lights in the room flickered, and Helena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if reality itself was buckling under some immense unseen pressure. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely audible, yet it resonated through her like a thunderclap. "You've opened the door, and now they can't be stopped. They'll take this world, and there's nothing you can do to stop them." Helena wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt frozen, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She could only stand there, paralyzed by fear, as the room around her seemed to fade, the edges blurring, twisting into shadows that stretched and writhed like living things. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. The lights stabilized, the room snapping back into sharp focus. Subject Zero was still there, still staring at her, but his expression was different now, blank, vacant, as if he was no longer present. She took a shaky step back, her heart hammering against her ribcage, and fumbled for the intercom. "Security, I need—" Before she could finish, his eyes snapped back to hers, and she heard him whisper, so softly that it almost got lost in the hum of the machines. "They're already here." And for the first time since the experiment began, Helena truly understood the weight of her actions. The door was open. The Watchers had been given a window to their world, and now they would come. The question that haunted her wasn't whether they would arrive, but how soon they would decide to show themselves. As she staggered out of the lab, the shadows behind her seemed to stretch, reaching, crawling, waiting, and in the silence she could almost hear them, whispering. Helena's office was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the harsh, bluish glow of her computer screen. She had been there for hours, her eyes bloodshot and her hands shaking as she sifted through encrypted files, hidden directories, and forgotten records. The facility's security clearance was extensive, but she had access to all of it, and she was determined to find answers. After what had happened with Subject Zero, there was no going back. She needed to know what she had done, what they had done. The incident report had been buried, almost as if someone wanted to erase any trace of it. The sedatives had failed, and Subject Zero had been confined. But there was more to the story. The whispers in the darkened corners of the lab, the way the staff looked at her with a mixture of fear and accusation. Something was wrong. And it had been wrong long before she ever set foot in that lab. She could feel it, like a dark, heavy weight pressing down on her chest, As she scanned through document after document, she stumbled across a file marked Project Exodus. Her breath hitched as she clicked it open, her pulse quickening. The file was heavily redacted, pages and pages of blacked-out text, but there were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that hinted at something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The words extraterrestrial samples, galactic network, and dimensional anomalies leaped out at her from the screen. She scrolled down, her eyes scanning frantically, and there it was, a transcript. A conversation between top-level military officials and a mysterious entity known only by the codename Orion. The transcript had been dated several decades ago, long before her project had even been conceptualized, but it referenced technology and biological materials far beyond anything Earth was capable of producing. She read, her hands trembling as the truth began to unravel. The samples we recovered from the crash site exhibit properties that defy known physics, organic material, yet non-terrestrial. Self-regenerating, able to withstand extreme conditions. If what you're suggesting is true, Orion, then... "We are only confirming what you already suspect, General," said the voice designated as Orion. "Your planet is part of a much larger system, a network that spans galaxies. You are not the first to attempt what you are doing, and you will not be the last." "What do you mean by that?" the General asked, his tone sharp. "Life is a tool," Orion replied, and Helena could almost hear the cold, mechanical indifference in its voice. "Your planet is a key node within the network. You believe you are resurrecting the dead, but in reality you are activating something much older, much more powerful than you can comprehend. Your experiments have opened a doorway, and through that doorway, others will come." Helena felt her blood turn to ice as she continued reading. The General's response was unreadable, blacked out by thick lines of redaction, but Orion's words lingered, echoing in her mind. They had known. They had always known. She wasn't just conducting an experiment. She was following a blueprint, a plan that had been set in motion long before she had ever been involved. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, reluctant to continue, but she couldn't stop now. She had to know. She scrolled further down, and her breath caught as she reached the final unredacted paragraph. "The gate must remain closed. If opened, the Watchers will return, and humanity will cease to be." The words seared into her mind, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The Watchers. Subject Zero had spoken about them, his voice laced with an eerie, calm certainty. They were ancient beings, older than the stars, hidden behind the veil of reality. And now, she had given them a way back. Her hands shook as she pushed away from the desk, her mind reeling. She felt sick, like the room was closing in around her, the walls pressing down, suffocating her. She had to find someone, tell someone. But who? The facility was already under heavy lockdown, and she had seen the looks on the faces of her superiors. They knew more than they were letting on. They always had. Helena forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the lab. She needed to confront Subject Zero to understand what was really happening. The halls were empty, the silence thick and oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her as she walked. When she reached the lab, the door was ajar. Her heart skipped a beat as she pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing her whole. The only light came from the dim green glow of the monitors, casting an eerie pallor over the room. Subject 0 was still there, strapped to the table, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with that same vacant, hollow expression. "Why did you bring me back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but it echoed unnaturally in the stillness. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, his head turned to face her, his lips curling into that unsettling, almost knowing smile. "You didn't bring me back," he said softly. "You brought them back." Helena's pulse quickened. "Who are they? The Watchers?" "They are not what you think," he replied, his voice low and steady, as if reciting a forgotten truth. "They are the architects, the custodians of this universe. They weave the threads of reality, connecting worlds, creating and unmaking life. But your kind, you disrupted the weave. You played with things you didn't understand, and now the balance has been broken." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the darkness coiling and twisting like a living thing. Helena felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine, her heart thudding loudly in her ears. "What do they want?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. Subject 0's eyes glittered with a strange, cold light. "They want what was always theirs. They've watched your world grow, watched it fester, and now they see an opportunity. Through me, they have a way in. Through me, they can reclaim what was lost." She took a step back, her mind reeling, trying to piece together what he was saying. "You're a gateway?" "I am many things," he said, his voice almost tender. "A messenger, a vessel, a harbinger. They sent me to make you understand, to show you that your world was never yours to begin with. You have only been borrowing it, and now it's time to give it back." Helena's throat tightened, her mouth dry. "We have to stop them," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew how hollow they sounded. Subject 0 chuckled, a low, chilling sound that reverberated through the room. "You still don't understand. You think you can stop what's already been set in motion. There is no stopping it. You've opened the door, and now they will walk through it. They are not coming to invade. They are coming to reclaim." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing dense and cold. Helena could see her breath misting in front of her face, and she felt a rising sense of dread, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to fray. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, to get as far away as possible, but her body refused to move. "You were always a part of the plan," he whispered, his voice barely more than a hiss. "Everything you've done, everything you thought was your choice. It was all leading to this moment. You were guided, manipulated, just like all the others. And now the Watchers will return, and your world will be woven into the tapestry once more." Helena wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something, but she could only stand there, frozen as the room began to shift, the shadows creeping closer, wrapping around her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She could feel them, pressing against her mind, filling her with images of worlds crumbling, stars dying, endless voids swallowing everything. She realized then, with a cold, crushing clarity, that there was no escape, no way to fight back. The plan had been set long ago, and she had been nothing more than a pawn in a cosmic game that spanned eons. The Watchers weren't coming. They were already here, and through her actions, she had given them the one thing they needed to make their return complete. Subject Zero's eyes glowed in the darkness, and as she met his gaze, she felt a sense of profound, inescapable despair. "The gate is open, Doctor." "Strauss," he said, his voice echoing in her mind, "and they are hungry." In that moment, Helena understood what true hopelessness felt like, an endless yawning abyss that swallowed her whole. The plan had been unveiled, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. And in the silence that followed, she could hear them, whispering through the dark, their voices growing louder, closer, until they were all around her, everywhere, suffocating her with their presence. She had given them a way in, and now they were coming. Helena stumbled down the dimly lit corridor, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in around her, the once familiar pathways of the facility now warped and twisted, as if the building itself was distorting, losing cohesion. Every step felt like a struggle against some unseen force, a pressure that threatened to crush her, to make her stop. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Her mind was a storm of chaos, fragments of information swirling together. Subject Zero's warnings, the cryptic files she had read, the whispers that had begun to seep through the walls, growing louder, more insistent. She tried to focus, to think of a way out, but it was impossible. The shadows had swallowed the facility, and within those shadows she could sense movement, as if something vast and unfathomable was shifting just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting. The lab was in lockdown. No one had come in or out for hours, and the facility's upper levels had gone silent, as if the world above had already been consumed. She reached the emergency panel near the elevator, her fingers fumbling as she tried to punch in the code to override the lockdown. The screen blinked, and for a moment it felt like hope. But then the light flickered, and the screen went dark, the words "access denied" flashing in blood-red letters. A sound echoed down the corridor behind her, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps, but distorted, wrong. Helena turned, her eyes wide, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out into darkness. But she could feel it, whatever it was. Something was coming, moving closer, and with it came a cold, suffocating sense of dread that made her want to claw at her own skin, just to escape it. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she was rooted in place, trapped by fear and exhaustion. She remembered the last conversation she'd had with Subject Zero, the way his eyes had seemed to pierce through her, as if seeing right into her soul. He had spoken of the Watchers, of a plan that had been in place long before she had even been born. A plan that had been waiting, patient and silent for someone to open the gate. She thought of all the things she had done, all the decisions she had made, and realized how little control she'd actually had. It was like watching herself from a distance, like a puppet on strings. Every step guided, every action leading her to this moment. And now the strings were tightening, pulling her towards something she could not escape. The lights flickered again, and she heard it, a low, resonant hum like a vibration running through the air, through the walls, through her bones. It wasn't coming from the machines. It was deeper, older, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying, tearing open. The sound grew louder until it was a roar, filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. And then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing, as if the world had been snuffed out, leaving only emptiness behind. Helena stood there, her body trembling, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. She was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, as if any action would trigger whatever lay on the other side of that silence. Then, slowly, she became aware of a new sensation, a presence vast and incomprehensible, pressing down on her from all sides. It was like standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into a bottomless abyss, knowing that something was staring back, something that existed beyond time, beyond space, beyond understanding. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned to see the walls begin to pulse, dark tendrils of shadow creeping out from the corners, stretching across the ceiling, the floor, the air itself. The shadows writhed, twisting and coiling like a nest of serpents, and within them she could see shapes, indistinct, shifting forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if they were not fully there, not fully real. And yet she could feel them, their eyes watching her, studying her, as if she was an insect pinned to a board. They weren't human. They weren't even close. They were something else entirely, something that defied any attempt to describe them. And as she gazed into the shadows, she felt her mind begin to unravel, torn apart by the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. They whispered, their voices blending together, 1,000 murmurs echoing in her ears, in her mind. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood their meaning, their intent. They were not here to negotiate. They were not here to explain. They were here to consume. She backed away, her legs weak, her body shaking, but the shadows followed her, creeping closer, tendrils reaching out, caressing her skin with a cold, alien touch. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The shadows pressed closer, and in them she saw faces, twisted, contorted, hollow-eyed faces, mouths stretched wide in silent screams, as if frozen in a moment of eternal torment. "Please," she whispered, barely able to speak, her voice choked with terror. "Please, make it stop." But the shadows did not stop. They surged forward, enveloping her, pulling her down, down into the dark, and as they did, she heard a voice, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not a voice meant for human ears, and yet she understood every word, the meaning searing into her brain, burning her from the inside out. "You have opened the way, you have called us here, and now your world belongs to us." Helena felt herself being dragged down, pulled into the shadows, into the darkness, and as she struggled, she realized that it was not just her body that was being consumed. It was her mind, her very essence, being torn apart, devoured piece by piece. She could feel them inside her, probing, sifting through her thoughts, her memories, as if searching for something, some final confirmation of what they already knew. The darkness deepened and the shadows pressed tighter, suffocating her, crushing her, until there was nothing left but pain, endless and overwhelming. And in that final moment she understood the truth that had been hidden from her, from everyone. The Watchers had always been there, hidden behind the thin veil of reality, waiting for someone foolish enough to give them a way in. Humanity had been their experiment, their plaything. And now that the experiment was over, they were taking back what was theirs. There was no escape, no salvation, no hope. The facility's power systems failed, the lights going out completely, plunging everything into darkness. Helena felt her consciousness slipping, dissolving, as if she was being pulled apart at the seams. But just before the darkness claimed her, she heard a final whisper, soft and gentle, almost tender, as if mocking her one last time. "Welcome back, child. Welcome to the real world. And then there was nothing. Days later, the facility was discovered by a government cleanup team, its corridors silent, empty, as if everyone inside had simply vanished. The labs were intact, the equipment untouched, but there was no sign of Helena Strauss or any of the others. Only the recordings remained, distorted and fragmented, filled with echoes of static and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. In the deepest, darkest corners of the building, something lingered, something that was not quite there, not quite real. It flickered just at the edge of perception, a shadow that moved without light, a whisper without a voice. The official reports would claim that the experiment had been a failure, that the facility had been abandoned due to unforeseen complications. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen the footage, heard the whispers, would never forget. Because they understood in a way that no one else could, that the experiment had succeeded. The gate had been opened, and the Watchers had returned. And somewhere, far beyond the edges of human understanding, they were still watching, still waiting, their eyes fixed on the tiny, fragile world that had dared to defy them. They had all the time in the universe. The darkness had arrived, and it was here to stay.